Good morning. Welcome to Embracing Change, Talking Through Trauma. And today my guest is Ivy Barron. And Ivy is living or her studio is in Austin, Texas. She's been practicing movement since 2005. She's the owner of Rescue It. Did I say that right, Ivy? I don't think I did.
Requisite.
Rescue It. Okay. Pilates. Her judgment-free zone approach to Pilates is informed by her background in social work and social justice. Ivy is dedicated to creating an inclusive environment experience for all folks where they can explore movement that works for their own unique bodies to feel safe. So that's not always included in traditional settings. Did I say that correctly, Ivy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So today, Ivy and I are going to be talking about holding space. And so my first question, Ivy, is how do you hold space for yourself?
You see me just take a big sigh?
Yeah, I did.
When you sent me that question, that was the rest of the questions that we talked about. I was like, I got that. How do I hold space for myself is a challenging one, because I think it looks different if I compartmentalize the different parts of my life. In terms of how I hold space for myself as a teacher and a movement practitioner, I've really shifted into asking more questions and listening more instead of instructing. And I've let go of this idea that I am the expert and you are my student. How we collaborate, and it's energizing. And it also, it takes some of the onus off of my shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
So that I can breathe a little bit. And I used to teach, and it was all about, in the beginning, what I was, the kudos I got, and how much I knew and how much I was going to show you what I knew. And as a almost 50-year-old person, I'm finally almost at that point where I realize I don't know a thing. And that creates so much space in my world. Yeah.
When I think about I think about holding space also as self-care.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure, we talked earlier, you said today is your admin day, which this is a Wednesday that I'm filming on. So you said, I get to do whatever I want. To me, that is self-care. It's self-care because you've built it into your schedule. Just like my Wednesdays are my podcast days, but they don't take a lot of time. So I get to do whatever speaks to me, I guess is where I'm going. It's what does my body need today? And moving like that. It's really holding space to me when in regards to clients is really, really important because it allows us to observe and ask very open-ended questions. At least this is and tell me if you don't do this, but observe and ask very open-ended questions and let people listen to their own bodies and what they need. And I know that you're really big on offering lots and lots of I don't like variations. I don't want to use the word modifications, but you offer lots of variations in your reels that you create. And if you haven't watched Ivy, her information will be at the end of this podcast, but she does wonderful, like you did. I mean, just like the whole, breaking things down for people and making it accessible for everybody is really something that I really admired in you. And that's why I started watching and reaching out to you going, oh, okay. So I think that when we hold space for ourselves, it gives us more opportunity to hold broader space, both emotionally, energetically, and even nervous system based. And I know that we talked a little bit about that, but I'm also coming from a nervous system, so trauma informed as well as a nervous system approach, because so many times people don't even realize that they're holding tension. And there was a word that you used that I really liked. Emotional, emotional release. Rather than saying they're having a trauma response, I loved that, really, the emotional release. So it's like guiding people to know that they feel safe, but it's the safety isn't just in our environment, it's safety within their own bodies. Mm-hmm. So you said, or I'm just going to paraphrase this. Through trauma awareness, how do you hold space for your clients when they're experiencing an emotional release?
It's funny. I always think of this anecdote because I just thought that everybody, because we're human beings, knows how to hold space for people. And I have a colleague who I love and I'm hoping is listening. Hi. Who we worked together for a while, and she came to me and was like, I had this client who was in this position and was so triggered around some assault that had happened previously in her life, and I didn't know what to do. And so what I realized is that if we're not doing our own work, then it's impossible to really hold space. And if we're defining what that means in that moment, I think it really looks different for each person. If I have who is like, I see a couple of people who are mental health practitioners who are very comfortable, naming like, "Ooh, I just dissociated," or "I so much. Wow, that must be," and that's a different conversation than somebody feeling something that they can't necessarily name. And that doesn't mean it's mine to name, but I can see it and take us through the rest of the session in a way that isn't dysregulating their nervous system. Mm-hmm. A great example would be if somebody is having, I think feet in strap. I think having your feet in the straps is potentially one of the most traumatizing, triggering positions for people.
Yes, I 100% agree. 100%.
Yes, it's up there. And where am I standing? And all of that is so, so important. So if somebody is I see on their face that they're uncomfortable, or they're crunching up, or their pelvis is tucking under, and you just see that trying to go into more of a protective place, I'm going to take them out of those straps, and maybe we go stand on wake up their feet a little bit, or do something that is grounding, that feels safe. And then maybe go back. It doesn't mean that we're never going back into feet and straps, but I think that's what, and I'm going to the next question we talked about a little bit, but that's what active listening looks like, right?
Yeah.
It's listening, it's feeling somebody's energy.
Yes. I am going to say that is feet and straps is one of my biggest, I'm just going to, what you talked about. And I can also say that for me, because I taught yoga for a really long time, is using feet up the wall, but then having, and I don't remember the name of it, spreading their legs against the wall and having, remember teaching. And it was like the pivotal point. So we're talking a long time ago, Ivy, that I was doing this. So I was trauma informed before I even knew I was trauma informed. And I was teaching in a homeless shelter, and these women, most of them had some kind of assault, sexual assault. And I had them laying down, their feet up against the wall, and probably 3 or 4 of these women, I'm like, I had to bring them down because there was all these emotions that went with it. And so when I think about the transverse from that position to legs in the strap, and the unawareness that people, instructors, and I'm not just going to say Pilates instructors because I think it crosses multiple, like movement, yoga, Pilates, fitness, personal trainer.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's something that we vastly underestimate because 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted. And I don't want to get on my preaching post about being trauma informed, but I feel it's so important to have an understanding of how people feel so violated, and how it can be so, they don't know where the emotions are coming from.
Mhm.
And again, it's when we talk about active listening, it's not just listening with our ears. It's listening. I like to use this term, listening with our eyes, listening to, observing to their body language, observing so many other things. And it's so, the term holding space, I think, is something that I have used a long time. And so when we were talking about holding space, it's just a term that I don't know how many other Pilates instructors use that terminology.
Mm. So for me, I used to live at a place called the Llama Foundation, which is an intentional community in New Mexico. Not to go too deep into it, but it started in the 60s, and it's one of the only intentional communities / retreat centers that's still in existence because it's very grounded and it's not too woo-woo. That aside, we were always, because everything was based on communication, because we were a consensus oriented group. So every decision that was made by everyone unanimously, or it didn't happen at all. And so we talked a lot about holding space for these conversations, holding space that was safe to emote, safe to be exactly who you are in that moment, safe to feel angry, safe to feel sad, safe to disagree, like all of that. We used to call it, the container, holding space container, right? And so that was a lot of years ago.
That's a long time ago.
20
Yeah.
So it's just part of my lexicon as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that you and I both are bringing vast, what I'm going to call skills, like from our past into what we're doing right now. And it's you can't separate. I can't separate the years and years and years that I worked with families, specifically children, and saw how they were impacted by trauma, but also realizing that, because in the beginning, people didn't want to hear about childhood trauma. And we bring all of our stuff with us. We haul our suitcase we come to class and everybody's lugging their own suitcases. They're all bringing their own issues. And I just want to touch on something you said that I feel is so important. As you said, we all need to do our work, our own personal work. And so oftentimes what I am seeing in the Pilates community is that people want to sugarcoat things. And they don't want to say exactly, there was no sugarcoating what you just said. We have to do our work. Mm-hmm. And it's so important. And I think that, and I'm not criticizing any of the other Pilates instructors. It's just, I have said from the very beginning when I started doing this work, I was not going to sugarcoat stuff that I talk about, because it's something that if you have a bias, you need to do the work and you need to understand where that bias is coming from. It could be something that you brought from your childhood, or maybe it brought, there's just a multitude of things that when we start to look at that kind of stuff. And it's sometimes, and it's not easy work, but it's when you get to the root of your own issues is when you begin to really open up and you can begin to see the change in how you teach.
Right. And I think what I see a lot in our industry, in the Pilates industry, is people, instructors getting triggered by their clients.
Yeah.
And the problem.
Yeah.
Well, my client is to X, Y, and Z, or they don't want to listen, or they don't. And it's really our own stuff. It doesn't mean we have to work with everybody or we're a great fit for everyone. But when I'm triggered by somebody, that's on me to investigate, because I'm in the position of power in this situation, big quote fingers. Because I don't believe in that hierarchy, but that's the reality. If I'm standing over somebody on a reformer, and they're lying down and I'm standing up, I'm in a more powerful position physically, just that, than they are. And so I feel like if I feel some kind of way over how somebody is reacting, which is usually a trauma response. If somebody taps at me or goes, I don't want to do that, I've had those moments where like, well, you better do that, because when I was a younger teacher, because I'm the instructor. And now I go, okay, let's talk about why you don't want to do that, or let's shift. We don't even have to talk about it. Let's shift into something else. You're the boss. And I can't remember the last time I've been triggered by somebody, because I've done that work.
Yeah. So Ivy, I want to I love what you just said, but so oftentimes, especially when I first started talking about trauma-informed movement, is I would hear people tell me, it's not in my scope. It's not in my scope
right.
of practice. And you and I are coming from a social work background, but it's not my job. And you have more of the skills if from your licensure, that if you needed to, but you're going to keep, I don't know. So I guess my question is do you keep the conversation more about movement, which is what I do as well. Like if they don't want to go there, well, what can we do to do differently? Or, not asking, I don't need to know about my client's trauma. It'll
right.
come out. Their bodies are going to tell us.
I think that's such a great question, because it's so important, especially around when you're naming that you're trauma informed or trauma aware, or using trauma in your
yes.
your messaging. I can speak for myself. I understand that in this room, in my studio, we're all about movement. My understanding that somebody is having a trauma response, or or their body language is reflecting some kind of trauma, it doesn't mean that it's explicitly talked about. It might be that I ask that person, that I ask permission, hey, I'm going to touch your feet. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yes. Instead of grabbing somebody or putting their hands. I have worked with instructors who, without asking, male instructors put their hands on people's bellies.
Yeah.
That, to me, like, I have a trauma response to watching that. But so it's not a therapy session. It's whether licensed or not, this room is not the room where we have a therapy session. Yeah. This is the room where a part of my tools is understanding to meet your trauma, or meet you where you are, period, in a way that is going to feel safe for you. Yeah. Yep.
Good. Yes. We speak the same language, maybe different words, but we speak the same language, because it's so important to ask before you touch. Always. And even with new clients, I I never touch on the first session, and I'll say to them, I will always ask you before I touch you, because you don't know how people feel, excuse me, feel from session to session.
Right.
So, yeah, it's really, and again, that's where you're meeting the clients where they are, you're holding space for them. And it's not about your agenda, of, based on, I mean, we're basing our sessions on the whole person that's in front of us.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's really, to me, I feel like it's even more critical right now because there's so many things that have happened since COVID that we have an understanding of what it's about to be trauma informed. And now I'm going to just say, the course that I teach can sometimes be deep, but it makes people to begin to look at what, like, it's taking it a one step further and going beyond anything at all what teacher trainings. I mean, they've totally missed the mark on this. And it's really interesting to me to see people, and I like to say it like this, is that people are circling around the outside, like they watch everything that I'm doing and they're circling around the outside edges. And I say to them, you can't be trauma informed by just reading small things. It's like talking to other people, like our conversation. And learning from people who have had the experience of working with people who've been affected by trauma outside of the industry, which is where I'm coming from as well. So, but yeah, it's,
I make the assumption that I don't play like the trauma Olympics or oppression Olympics, right? I feel like
I know
the assumption that everybody who comes through my doors has experienced trauma. I just saw there was a study, I don't quote me on this because I saw it on TikTok, full disclosure, but it was so fascinating that they were showing these rats or having these rats smell cherry, and then they would.
I know this study. Keep going.
Yeah. Did they zap them or did they just play a loud noise? They did something that caused trauma for the rats when they smelled this particular scent. Their babies had the same fear response, never having had that traumatic experience. And so there's generations. My point is, it doesn't have to be an event in my lifetime that dysregulates my nervous system. It could have to do with the fact that my grandfather had to escape Cossacks, right, in Russia. It could be literally generational trauma that is in my cells.
There is, I think it's really important that we talk about those kind of things. And they're like intergenerational trauma or generational trauma is just, it's really important to have an understanding that it's in our DNA. There's a book that I really like, and it's called It Didn't Start With Us. And it looks at, it looks at like questions, and again, this is a book for you as a person, it's not a teaching tool that I've used, but it's to explore where some of my like roots have come from. But it asks deep questions about your childhood. It asks deep questions about like your mother, your grandmother, and it's like through those kinds of things that like I had so many, and I just read it for my own self, and people are, and it was so empowering because I realized that there was a lot of things that was very coincident. It was not just coincidental, because stuff that started with my great grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and myself, and even into like my own daughters. And it's really, really important. There's another book, Ivy, and I don't know if you've ever read it before, but hold on, I'm going to grab it real quick.
Okay.
All right. It's called Fearing the Fat Body. Fearing the Black Body is what I meant to say.
Can I see that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, fearing the black body. Yes, I do
Yeah.
have that. Yeah.
Yeah. The only reason why I brought that up is because it's really, that what to me was really important, because it begins to look at the origin of where some of the root stuff that's happening right now in the fat phobia, like right now with Pilates. And it's like, when I read that and tied it back to like just observing and listening, and it's kind of crazy that somebody would write about this. And I actually have a friend who recommended the book to me, and she is a trauma therapist as well, Ivy, but she also is a Pilates instructor, and she's a plus size body. And she was the one, she's like, you need to read that. And so to me, that was how it just opened a whole nother like doors for me, in how we as white women have so many more privileges around different things, but it's our responsibility to become educated when we're working with people, because these traumas that I was talking about from here, those traumas are centuries old, but they're still prevalent today. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
Right. I was part of, and exactly part of the reason why I made the conscious decision to start showing up publicly in this body, because when, after reading that book and listening to lots of Black women in larger bodies over, especially during the pandemic, where that was all I did was like absorb social media, but like realizing that by not showing up, by participating in diet culture I knew it was harming me, but I also did not realize how much I was participating in white supremacy by doing those things. And so for me, being consciously calling out fat phobia is a part of, and no longer participating in that internalized fat phobia is a part of my deconstructing my own internalized anti-racism or internalized racism. And I can no longer separate the two, because once you know. Yeah.
And I think that's really important to talk about. I mean, we're having a very small conversation about it right now, but I think it's really important to understand your own like values around things, and having an understanding of why we show up like we do. And it's really, it's almost, I feel it's a crucial part of teaching myself. Mm-hmm. So, and I like to, like, that's why when I talked about being trauma informed from a movement educator standpoint, it's not about being an expert in it. It's having an understanding from a body perspective and a nervous system perspective. So, but Ivy, our conversation has been wonderful today. I think that, let me look at our notes here, because I think, especially like when you were talking about the diet culture, I think that's something that's so deeply ingrained in our like size, like body size, body shapes. I think it's so ingrained in the Pilates industry that until you start talking about it and bringing it forward. I did a reel a few weeks ago, and I entitled, "It's Not About Being Fat or Thin," fat or thin. And I was amazed at how many, and all I did was talk. And I did some movement, but I had over 700 people listen to it. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've had reels that have gone equally as well as I did. But I was really surprised, because it's so much deeper. It's so much deeper.
It's a distraction. Is how I see it. That's how I've seen it for years, but not really known what to do with it. And what I mean by that is it's focusing on body size. For instance, let's just take that. Focusing on body size and not feeling like I statement enough, as I couldn't be out in the world as a Pilates instructor. I had to I knew what I did and I knew I was really good at what I did, but I kept myself really small because I didn't want to have to justify the size of my bum or my menopausal belly, or I didn't want to have to say, well, I'm a Pilates instructor, but here's why, I do post rehab, or I would make myself small, even though that's not all I did, because of my own internalized stuff. And we were talking about unpacking our own trauma in order to hold space for people.
Yeah.
For so many years, and I know I'm not alone, it was my body size that I focused on, and it took up so much space in my day-to-day activities that there was no space to focus on deeper stuff and unpack the stuff that really needed to be unpacked. And I think it's that way by design, because it's a billion-dollar industry, right? It wants us to feel small. It wants us to feel like we need it to be valued and valuable. But that's a load of crap. We don't need it. We really don't. So I don't know where I was going with that, other than, yes, the body size piece in our industry is still so prevalent, but there's those of us that are kind of rising up and talking behind the scenes and knowing that the tides are shifting and that we can be a part of that shift.
And so Ivy, and I'm just, and I don't talk a lot, you shared a little bit about you, but I'm going to just share a little bit about myself. I've been on the other end of that, where I've belonged to the eating disorder portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would restrict calories and do things that would keep me in a place, what I thought was in my perfect body. And when I started recognizing and identifying what was happening with myself, it opened a whole nother level of awareness. And even though I have never been heavy or in a plus size body, it still was coming back to I was never good enough. I was never good enough. I was never, I don't know. It was just, I was never good enough. And then, or I would gain 5 pounds and then I would go into a spasm or something. So I think that we all have our own reasonings for coming forward with things like that. But I also can say that there's times that even now that I have to be very careful with myself, but I can also say to you that I too had to really listen, because I was triggered by stuff that somebody else said on social media. And that's where I started to rise up and say, it doesn't matter about our size.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When I hear words like, I was never good enough, it always brings me back. And that's just, I'm always going to come back to white supremacy, because I think we as white women need to explicitly name it over and over and over again. But there is a trope that shows up in Pilates big time, but is, definitely more culturally pervasive, that as white women, we need to be what we consider perfect at all times. And when we stray from that socially constructed, racist idea, ableist, ageist, et cetera, idea of what perfection looks like, then we go into that self-doubt or the spiral or the disordered eating or the disordered exercising, right? Or lashing out at other people. Those people that come into, they don't come into my comments so much, but I know that they're coming into other people's comments. It's because they're so uncomfortable with this mirror, that, and they don't know what to do with it. And so they lash. And that's internalized.
Yeah. And that's where I think that, I've been on that end of it as well. And it's like, it's just like saying, no, where we all have a space in this community, and it's beginning to find a voice and speak out and say, it's just, to me, it's so important. So, but yeah, it was really, I don't know. I think that the conversation we could have would be much bigger than where we are right now with it. But I think that but putting it out in the open and talking about it and saying, we're like thinking about our own identity and and not everybody is going to walk around with confidence. You got to look at where things are coming from to how it impacts you. So again, going back to the work and understanding. So, but yeah. So Heidi, thank you so much for joining me today. This will not be our last conversation. I already know that. So if you can hold on for a second and I'll stop the recording.
Okay.
Thank you.